So what we've done here, this is the inside of the waistband, and we've just done a Hong Kong bind along the bottom. So because this is going to sit down, we're not having the seam allowance going up inside the waistband. So we've used this tape here, which is this wide. So what happens, and you can watch the other video as well with more of an explanation about this. There's a separate video tutorial for Hong Kong binds. And this stitches on here, so stitches on, flips underneath, and then goes up like that on the inside, and then it's ditch stitched, so it's not stitching through the actual bias, it's stitching right next to it. And the excess fabric is just going to go up inside the waistband. In the tutorial, it's for a seam, an open seam, so we've actually trimmed some of this back, but in this instance we don't need to. Okay, so now we're going to sew this onto our waist. Now what we need to do here, it's not just a matter of popping that there and stitching that along. We actually want, what we want to happen is when this is finished, we want it to sit like this on the inside, so that it's at the edge of the tape. And you can see here that I need to, because of that, because we don't need the fabric, you know, on the waistband from here to here, we just need to pull that back a little bit. So what I'm doing is I usually do 1.5 centimeters from the edge of the zip tape to the raw edge here. So just line that up. You don't have to be exactly right, because there's a bit of flexibility in there, but it's a good 1.5 centimeters is a good amount to play with. And now what I'm doing is I'm just catching the edge of the zip tape. So you can see there, I've just caught a little bit of that tape there. And it means that when this is folded back in a minute, you see most of the tape, but it means that this fabric here on the facing doesn't interfere with the zip. Okay.
So what that 1.5 relates to is about 7 millimeters in to centre back from where the finished.
Yeah, exactly.
So
from here
in and 7 out, so
there.
that's 1.5 total.
So now, so that we don't get this twisted, because sometimes it's easy to do it over length, just work your way around. You can even, you have notches there at the center front, so if you want to, you can pop a pin in there, and then just keep working around to the other side. And we're going to do the same thing on the other side here. So 1.5 centimeters from the zip tape to the edge there. And just stitch that up. You can see that sits back there. Okay, now we can't just stitch along there because you'll see that it won't add up. This is too short. So what you need to do when you're putting this into position now is you actually need to fold on the tape there, on the zip tape. So fold there, and then the seam allowances all go towards the inside. So I'll put this under the foot, and we're going to have a centimetre seam allowance along the top here. Now I've just got started, and now I'm just going to hold this. Again, sewing along this top edge at 1 centimetre, just making sure that the raw edges match. And through to the other side, again we're turning that back on itself with the seam allowances going towards the facing or the inside of the waistband. Okay, so we've stitched that in place along the top there. Before we need to do some understitching, but before that, what we're going to do is we're going to turn out this corner and see that our top edges match up. So what we're going to do, we're not going to cut any of this off. We're just going to fold. So I've got put my fingers in between the two layers, fold that down there, and then just poke that through. Give it a little bit of a wiggle. So I pull that out, you can see that there. It's quite a nice finish. And the thing about having the zip going all the way to the top as well is that you don't need a hook and eye at that to hold it together, because the zip secures it all the way to the top. Same on this side, put your fingers in between the two layers, push the seam allowance down, and just pop that out there.
Probably a good idea to do up the zip at this point too, and just make sure that the waistband is even at the top.
That's exactly what I was going to do.
You're just going to do that. I've beaten you to it.
Oh, look at that. Oh,
perfect.
So that's good.
So if that was out, you could easily go in and just take a little bit more out of
exactly.
one side.
So yeah, so if this was a bit longer, you would just take this out again, and you would just sew the seam a little bit bigger or a little bit smaller, depending. So that's worked out nicely. Okay, so now we're just going to finish off this top edge by starting. Now you won't be able to get right into the corner here, so start in as close as you can, and we're going to understitch, which means that we're going to stitch through this layer and we're going to stitch through the seam allowances there. So through the 3 layers of fabric, and that's just going to hold that fabric out of the way, and we'll show you that after this is done. Just watch that you've got fabric under here, so just make sure that's all pushed out of the way. And you'll see I'm stitching, you can see because I've used the black thread, that's my original stitch line, so I'm stitching on this side through those 3 layers. Sometimes people stitch there, which actually doesn't do anything at all. So make sure that you're actually stitching on the facing piece.
Quite well on this, that the stitch line is on the facing side of the waistband, and all of the seam allowance underneath, you can see it's all pushed towards the facing.
So yes, we want you to get close to it, and I think that's why sometimes it looks like we're actually stitching on this one, but we stitch on that one because, understitching is generally, just a millimetre away from the original stitch line. So I've got it there, so it's about 3 centimetres from that edge there. Yeah. So I'm just going to go and give this a press now.
Really helps it sit under really well, so that none of the facing is showing on the outside.
Exactly. So yep, there's the outside, and that understitching has helped pull this seam allowance here, that stitch line, just to the inside of the garment, so it has a really nice clean edge there. So I'm going to just give this a press, and then I'll come back to do the ditch stitching. Alright, so I've got my waistband here. I've done the understitching, I've given that a press, so it's all nice and all the working stitching's inside there now. So what we're going to do now is, just to be consistent with no stitching along the top edge, we're going to have no stitching along the bottom edge. Well, none on the waistband anyway, and we're going to ditch stitch, which means that we're going to tuck it in under here below the waistband. And the only thing that we need to do is, because it's going to be stitched here, which sort of sits here, you still get a little bit of this. So what I do there is just tuck that under on the diagonal, and so it's tucked under there. The other thing too, sometimes like when you're starting doing stitching like this, you can actually bring both threads up to the top and pull them behind, so you'll get a tail there, but you just cut that off, because sometimes with this, it'll be fine at the top, but underneath you'll get this sort of bulk from the other bits of the thread that were underneath. So this just gives you a slightly cleaner finish. And don't stitch too close to the teeth. We don't want to stitch through the teeth, so come a couple of millimetres away from away from the teeth. And I've got that started, and something that I should have done, because we want this to sit down along the way here, is that you can actually put a couple of pins in. So this is the side seam. Our center front should be around here. And then the side seam over this side as well. Just to give us some definite anchor points to work towards. And with this as well, what can happen sometimes when you're stitching this is that the top can drag and create a bit of excess fabric here. So as you're sewing, you know, like hold the fabric in place, and if anything, you're sort of just pushing slightly under the foot. So so there's not as much drag going this way, sort of counteracting that.
You can see where Mark's stitching. He's actually stitching on the skirt, not on the waistband. Stitching in the ditch, so really getting right beside where that seam line is. And
it's still going to be very obvious because I'm stitching it in black thread, so you can see what I'm doing. But in the real thing, if you're stitching, you know, in a matching thread, it really does disappear into the ditch. Oop, and I forgot on this side. Just going to get in there and tuck that up. So I probably should have tucked that up before and put a pin in there. And again, start a couple of millimeters, or stop a couple of millimeters away from the teeth there. So actually, if you look at it that side, you can see the black. And if you look at it from that side, it sort of falls into the shadow there. So you can imagine if this was a matching thread, that it, you know, it really would disappear. And that's our waistband finished.